By the winter of 1943–44, the Italian campaign had already defied Allied expectations. What had been planned as a rapid advance up the peninsula instead hardened into a grinding struggle against terrain, weather, and a German defense designed to trade space for time with ruthless efficiency. Monte Cassino became the focal point of that struggle, not because it was the only route north, but because it controlled the routes that mattered most. At the center of the Cassino problem was geography. The town of Cassino sat astride the Liri Valley, the most direct corridor toward Rome. Towering above it was the Monte Cassino Massif, crowned by the ancient abbey. From those heights, German observers could see into the valley, adjust artillery fire, and dominate movement along the roads and river crossings below. Any force attempting to push north without neutralizing Cassino would expose itself to enfilade fire and constant disruption. The German defense exploited this perfectly. Rather than defend every inch of ground, German commanders anchored their line on key terrain, forcing the Allies to attack uphill, across rivers, and into prepared positions. This defensive belt, known collectively as the Gustav Line, was not a single trench system, but a network of mutually supporting strongpoints, bunkers, gun positions, and infantry defenses integrated into the natural landscape. Cassino was its keystone. Allied planners understood this in theory. In practice, breaking the line proved far harder than anticipated. The terrain around Cassino negated many Allied advantages. Armor was constrained by narrow roads and soft ground. Artillery struggled with observation and counter-battery fire from concealed positions. Air power, while powerful, could not easily destroy dug-in defenses embedded in rock and ruins. German doctrine emphasized exactly this kind of fight. Units were trained to hold ground stubbornly, withdraw only under overwhelming pressure, and reconstitute defenses behind natural obstacles. Cassino offered everything such a defense required: elevation, cover, fields of fire, and limited approaches. The result was a battlefield where every Allied advance had to be paid for in blood. The first assaults reflected this imbalance. Allied forces attempted frontal attacks across rivers like the Rapido, under fire from well-sighted machine guns and artillery. These attacks were costly and often futile. Units were pinned, disrupted, or destroyed before they could gain a foothold. Gains, when achieved, were measured in hundreds of meters and often could not be held against counterattack. Weather compounded the problem. Winter rains turned the valley into mud. Rivers flooded. Supply routes deteriorated. Infantry fought soaked, cold, and exhausted. The conditions favored the defender, who could remain largely static, while attackers struggled simply to reach their starting lines. One of the most persistent misconceptions about Cassino is that the abbey itself was the primary German strongpoint. In reality, German forces initially avoided occupying the abbey, respecting its cultural significance and recognizing that the surrounding terrain provided better defensive positions. The strength of the Cassino defense lay not in one building, but in the layered network around it. Ridges, slopes, riverbanks, and villages turned into fortresses. This distinction mattered because it shaped Allied decision-making. Frustration with repeated failures led to increasingly drastic measures, including the decision to bomb the abbey. That decision would transform the battlefield, but not in the way the Allies intended. Rubble created by bombing provided even more cover for German defenders, turning ruins into ready-made strongpoints and complicating Allied assaults further. At its core, Cassino resisted because it was never meant to be taken quickly. The German objective was delay, not annihilation. Every day the Gustav Line held bought time for defenses further north to be prepared. The Italian campaign was not about stopping the Allies outright. It was about slowing them enough to influence the broader war. For the Allies, this created a dilemma. Bypassing Cassino was extremely difficult, given the terrain and limited routes. Repeated frontal assaults promised only attrition. Amphibious operations, like the landing at Anzio, were intended to outflank the line, but even those depended on pressure at Cassino to succeed. Everything came back to the same point. Cassino absorbed Allied manpower, artillery, air power, and attention at a staggering rate. Each failed assault forced reconsideration, reorganization, and renewed effort. Multinational Allied forces, American, British, French, Indian, New Zealand, Polish, and others, were drawn into the struggle, each bringing different tactics and facing the same obstacles. The persistence of the German defense was not a miracle. It was the product of preparation, terrain, and doctrine aligned perfectly with the strategic situation. German units rotated in and out of the line, preserving combat effectiveness. Artillery was used economically but decisively. Counterattacks were limited but effective, designed to restore positions rather than pursue breakthroughs. By early 1944, it was clear that Cassino would not fall through isolated assaults or symbolic gestures. The line would have to be strangled slowly, its flanks pressured, its reserves exhausted, its defenders ground down over time. This realization marked a shift in Allied thinking from rapid penetration to systematic destruction. Cassino, in other words, was not a single battle. It was a campaign within a campaign, defined by repetition, attrition, and adaptation. The river crossings, the town, the slopes, and the abbey all became chapters in a longer story about how modern armies break fortified lines when speed fails. The first Allied assaults at Cassino were not reckless. They were methodical, planned according to doctrine that had worked elsewhere, and supported by artillery, armor, and air power. What failed was not effort or courage, but alignment between plan and reality. Each assault collided with the same constraints: terrain, observation, and German defensive design, and each failure exposed limits the Allies would have to confront before the line could be broken. The initial focus fell on river crossings. Rivers like the Rapido formed natural obstacles directly in front of German positions. On maps, they appeared manageable. In practice, they were lethal. Crossing points were narrow, approaches were exposed, and defenders had pre-registered artillery and machine gun fire covering every likely route. Infantry units attempting to cross were forced into bottlenecks where surprise was impossible and momentum fragile. Artillery preparation preceded these assaults, but its effects were limited. German positions were dug into rocky ground, shielded by reverse slopes and natural cover. Shelling disrupted surface features but left the core of the defense intact. When the barrage lifted, defenders emerged quickly, weapons ready, fields of fire unchanged. The result was devastating for attackers caught mid-crossing. Armor could not compensate. Tanks struggled to reach the rivers in the first place, bogged down by mud and constrained by roads. Even when they crossed, they were vulnerable to anti-tank guns firing from elevated, concealed positions. Cassino denied the Allies the combined arms synergy they relied on. Infantry advanced without effective armor support. Armor advanced without infantry protection. Both paid the price. Urban fighting inside the town added another layer of difficulty. Cassino itself became a maze of rubble, narrow streets, and fortified buildings. German defenders adapted quickly, turning ruins into strong points and shifting positions constantly to avoid concentrated fire. Each block had to be cleared individually. Progress was slow, casualties high, and gains fragile. Air power, often decisive elsewhere, delivered mixed results. Bombing could destroy visible structures, but it could not reliably neutralize defenders embedded in rock and debris. In some cases, bombing made the situation worse by creating more cover for the defense. The destruction altered the terrain, but not in the attacker's favor. These early failures revealed a crucial truth. Cassino could not be taken through frontal assault alone. The line was not brittle. It was elastic within limits, absorbing punishment and reforming behind obstacles. German commanders did not counterattack recklessly. They restored positions where possible and withdrew deliberately where necessary, preserving combat power. Each failed assault taught the Allies something. River crossings under direct observation were prohibitively costly without suppression of higher ground. Bombardment alone could not substitute for control of terrain. Multinational coordination needed improvement. Units rotating into the line required time to learn the battlefield, and that learning was paid for in casualties. The psychological toll mounted. Units returned to the line again and again, often to the same ground under similar conditions. Familiarity bred neither comfort nor advantage. Instead, it reinforced the sense that the defense was unyielding. Morale fluctuated, not because soldiers lacked resolve, but because progress seemed disconnected from sacrifice. German morale, by contrast, benefited from the pattern. Successful defense reinforced confidence. Units learned they could survive bombardment and repel attacks. This did not make the defense invulnerable, but it strengthened cohesion at precisely the moment the Allies needed it to weaken. Command decisions grew more consequential. Pressure to achieve results increased. The decision to bomb the Abbey, taken in this atmosphere, reflected both frustration and misinterpretation. It was believed that the structure served as a German observation post. In reality, the bombing removed a landmark, but did not remove the defense. The rubble that remained was quickly incorporated into the German system, complicating subsequent assaults. The failures also highlighted the importance of flanking pressure. Cassino could not be reduced in isolation. Its strength derived from its integration into the wider Gustav Line. As long as neighboring sectors held, defenders could rotate units and maintain depth. This realization pushed Allied planners toward broader operations designed to stretch the line rather than batter one point endlessly. Anzio was intended to serve that purpose. By landing behind the line, the Allies hoped to force German withdrawal or redeployment. But without decisive pressure at Cassino, Anzio stalled as well. The interdependence of operations became clear. Cassino and Anzio were linked problems. Solving one required progress on the other. The lesson of these early assaults was not that Cassino was impregnable, it was that breaking it required a shift from isolated attacks to systemic pressure. Attrition had to be applied not just to frontline units, but to the entire defensive network, reserves, supply routes, observation points, and morale. By the end of the early phases, Allied commanders understood that success would come only through synchronization, multiple corps attacking in concert, flanks pressured simultaneously, and advances coordinated across the breadth of the line. Cassino would fall not because one assault succeeded, but because the defense could no longer sustain the cumulative strain. The blood spilled in these failed attacks was not wasted in a narrow sense. It exposed the mechanics of the defense and forced adaptation. But it came at a high cost, and it delayed the moment when the Allies could apply their full strength effectively. By the time Allied planners prepared the next phase at Cassino, the illusion of a quick solution was gone. What replaced it was a colder understanding of how fortified systems actually fail. Cassino would not collapse from shock. It would have to be suffocated, its observation denied, its reserves stretched, and its defenders exhausted until holding the line cost more than abandoning it. The first adjustment was conceptual. Earlier assaults had treated Cassino as a discrete objective: seize the town, cross the rivers, break through the Gustav Line. Experience revealed that Cassino functioned as part of a wider organism. Its strength depended on neighboring sectors, interior lines of movement, and the ability to rotate units under cover. Attacking Cassino alone was like striking a limb while leaving the body intact. Allied planning shifted toward simultaneity. Pressure would be applied across the front rather than concentrated narrowly. This did not mean abandoning Cassino as a focal point, but integrating it into a broader offensive designed to deny the Germans the luxury of choice. If reserves moved to reinforce Cassino, other sectors would exploit the thinning line. If reserves were held back, Cassino would be hammered harder. Artillery coordination improved dramatically. Earlier bombardments had been intense but episodic. Now fire planning emphasized continuity and depth. Instead of short preparatory barrages, artillery was used to isolate the battlefield, interdicting roads, supply routes, and assembly areas behind the line. The goal was not just to hit defenders, but to prevent relief. A position could survive shelling if it could be resupplied and reinforced. Deny those functions, and endurance collapsed. Air power was integrated with this logic. Rather than attempting to smash individual strong points, aircraft focused on bridges, road junctions, and rear area movement. This compounded artillery effects and forced German logistics into predictable patterns. Supplies moved at night, in smaller quantities, under increasing risk. Ammunition shortages became more frequent. The defense began to consume itself. Terrain exploitation also improved. Allied commanders recognized that some ground was more valuable than others, not for occupation, but for observation. Securing ridges and slopes that overlooked the valley denied German gunners the ability to adjust fire effectively. Even limited gains in elevation paid dividends by blinding parts of the defense. Each blind spot reduced the effectiveness of the whole system. Multinational coordination, initially a weakness, became a strength. Different Allied formations brought different capabilities. Mountain troops were better suited for high ground. Infantry accustomed to rough terrain handled slopes others struggled with. Armor was used more selectively, committed only where conditions allowed. The battle became less about uniform methods and more about matching tools to terrain. German responses remained disciplined, but increasingly constrained. Commanders continued to trade space for time, but the space available was shrinking. Each withdrawal shortened the line and reduced maneuver room. Rotating units became harder as routes were interdicted. Fresh formations arrived already under strain. The defense began to lose elasticity. Attrition now worked in the Allies' favor. Earlier, losses had bought little. Now, each casualty degraded the system more visibly. Units held fewer men per sector. Gaps were filled thinly. Counterattacks, once sharp and effective, became rarer and more localized. The defense still fought hard, but it was fighting downhill, figuratively and literally. One of the most telling indicators of strain was the change in German artillery employment. Fire became more reactive, less coordinated. Ammunition conservation limited volume. Guns were displaced more frequently to avoid counter-battery fire, reducing consistency. The defensive orchestra that had once synchronized fire across the valley began to fall out of rhythm. Psychological pressure mounted alongside material strain. Defenders had endured months of bombardment, attack, and counterattack. Fatigue was cumulative. The knowledge that Allied pressure was increasing, not diminishing, eroded confidence. Cassino was no longer a wall. It was a position being slowly compressed. The Allies, too, paid heavily. Progress remained slow and costly, but the difference now was direction. Each phase produced tangible effects that carried forward. Ground gained was consolidated. Observation improved. German options narrowed. Momentum, while not dramatic, became measurable. This phase also clarified the relationship between Cassino and Anzio. Pressure inland forced German commanders to balance competing threats. Holding Cassino too rigidly risked collapse elsewhere. Reinforcing Anzio risked weakening the Gustav Line. The German defense was stretched not by a single blow, but by competing demands it could no longer satisfy simultaneously. The culmination of this adaptation was a coordinated offensive designed to apply maximum pressure across the line. Multiple corps attacked in concert. Artillery fire was synchronized. Air support targeted interdiction rather than spectacle. The objective was not a breakthrough at any cost, but the cumulative failure of the defense to cope with sustained, integrated assault. When the German line finally began to snap, it did not do so uniformly. Some positions held longer than others. Some units withdrew in order, others collapsed abruptly. What mattered was that the defense could no longer stabilize. Each withdrawal exposed the next position. Each loss of ground compounded strain elsewhere. Cassino's fall was therefore not the triumph of a single tactic or unit. It was the product of learning, of recognizing how fortified lines fail and adjusting methods accordingly. The Allies did not overpower Cassino by throwing more men at it blindly. They did so by denying the defense the conditions it required to function. This lesson carried implications beyond Italy. It demonstrated that modern defenses embedded in terrain cannot be broken quickly without unacceptable cost. They must be isolated, blinded, and exhausted. Speed is not always the decisive factor. Control and persistence can be. By the time the Allies prepared the final assaults, Cassino was no longer the same problem it had been months earlier. The line still existed, but its internal logic was failing. The moment of rupture was approaching, not because the defenders lacked courage, but because the system sustaining them was running out of capacity. The final phase at Cassino did not begin with a dramatic reversal. It began with an absence. German counterattacks that had once restored positions no longer came with the same speed or coordination. Artillery responses grew sporadic. Units that had previously rotated out of the line remained in place longer, not by design, but by necessity. The defensive system was still intact on maps, but it was losing the ability to correct itself. This was the critical threshold. Fortified lines do not fail when they are breached at a single point. They fail when they lose the capacity to respond coherently to pressure. At Cassino, that capacity was eroded by months of attrition, interdiction, and cumulative fatigue. When the final Allied offensives began, the German line was already operating at its limits. Allied attacks now unfolded with a different rhythm. Instead of isolated thrusts, pressure was applied across multiple sectors simultaneously. River crossings were supported by deeper artillery fires that didn't lift cleanly but followed advancing units, suppressing counterfire and preventing defenders from re-establishing positions. Engineers moved forward with infantry, reducing delays that had previously stalled momentum. Gains were modest but continuous. German units attempted to hold, but the cost of doing so rose sharply. Positions that had once been defensible became liabilities as surrounding ground fell under Allied observation. Holding meant exposure to artillery without the prospect of relief. Withdrawal, once a controlled maneuver, increasingly became the only rational choice. But withdrawal under fire, with routes interdicted, accelerated disorder. The town of Cassino itself illustrated this transition starkly. Earlier, German defenders had used the ruins to their advantage, moving through rubble and striking from concealed positions. Now, those same ruins trapped them. Observation from surrounding heights and improved Allied coordination turned the town into a killing ground. Movement became dangerous even at night. Supplies arrived irregularly. Casualties could not be evacuated efficiently. The fighting remained brutal and local. Individual buildings changed hands repeatedly. Units fought room by room, cellar by cellar. But the larger pattern had shifted. Each German success was isolated and temporary. Each Allied gain, once consolidated, fed into the next. The defense could no longer reset the fight. Pressure on the flanks proved decisive. As Allied forces made progress on adjacent sectors of the Gustav Line, Cassino lost its strategic anchor. The town and massif no longer functioned as the keystone of a continuous defensive belt. They became a salient, dangerous to hold because collapse elsewhere threatened encirclement. German commanders faced a narrowing set of options, none of them favorable. This was the moment when delay ceased to have value. The original purpose of Cassino had been to buy time. By the time the final offensives were underway, that time had already been bought and spent. Defending longer no longer served a strategic function. It merely increased losses. Orders to hold continued, but their meaning had changed. They were expressions of political will rather than operational logic. At the front, local commanders made decisions based on survival and cohesion rather than directives that no longer reflected battlefield reality. Units withdrew when they could do so without immediate destruction. Others fought until they were overrun. The Allied breakthrough did not resemble a flood. It resembled a slow release of pressure that suddenly allowed movement. Once key positions were abandoned or taken, the line unraveled quickly. Routes opened. Resistance thinned. The defense that had absorbed punishment for months could not adapt to the speed of change once it began. Crucially, this did not mean German forces collapsed everywhere simultaneously. Some formations withdrew in good order and re-established defenses further north. But the Gustav Line itself, of which Cassino was the heart, ceased to exist as a meaningful barrier. The Allies had achieved what earlier assaults could not a local success, but systemic failure. The fall of Cassino altered the operational landscape immediately. Allied forces could move into the Liri Valley in strength. Armor, previously constrained, now had room to maneuver. Supply routes shortened. Coordination improved. The Italian campaign regained momentum that had been absent for months. For the German command, the loss forced a recalculation. Defensive lines prepared further north had to be occupied sooner and under worse conditions. Units arrived depleted. Terrain further up the peninsula offered opportunities, but none as strong as the Gustav Line anchored on Cassino. The calculus of delay shifted against the defenders. The human cost of the break was immense. Cassino had already earned its reputation as one of the bloodiest battles of the campaign. The final phase added to that toll. But the significance of the battle lies not in casualty figures alone. It lies in what those casualties purchased, or failed to purchase, for each side. For the Allies, the cost bought a decisive operational change. For the Germans, the cost bought nothing further. The line snapped not because the defenders lacked skill or resolve, but because the conditions that made resistance effective had been systematically removed. This distinction matters because it clarifies why Cassino endured so long and then fell relatively quickly. Fortified defenses can withstand extraordinary punishment as long as they retain observation, supply, and the ability to maneuver reserves. Once those pillars erode, collapse can follow rapidly, even after months of resistance. Cassino's break was therefore not a surprise. It was the inevitable outcome of sustained pressure applied correctly. The final assaults succeeded because they occurred after the defense had been hollowed out, not because they were inherently superior to earlier efforts. Monte Cassino is often remembered for what it looked like at the end. A shattered town, a ruined abbey, exhausted armies fighting over rubble. That image obscures why the battle mattered. Cassino was not decisive because of the territory it yielded. It was decisive because it proved, at enormous cost, how fortified systems fail when speed is impossible and maneuver is constrained. The lessons learned there shaped the remainder of the Italian campaign and echoed far beyond it. Cassino forced a reckoning with attrition. Earlier Allied planning in Italy had assumed that pressure and mobility could compensate for difficult terrain. Cassino demonstrated the opposite. When terrain denies maneuver, pressure must be applied patiently and systemically. The battle showed that fortifications embedded in natural features cannot be rushed without catastrophic losses, and that shock alone is insufficient when the defender controls observation and interior lines. What ultimately broke the German line was not a single innovation or heroic assault. It was the cumulative denial of the defender's essentials: observation, supply, and reserve mobility. Cassino fell when these pillars failed together. That sequence matters because it explains why earlier assaults, no matter how determined, could not succeed. They struck at positions without dismantling the system that sustained them. The battle also clarified the limits of air power against dug-in defenses. Bombing could destroy structures, but it could not reliably neutralize infantry protected by terrain and rubble. In some cases, it improved the defense by creating cover. Cassino taught Allied commanders to treat air power as a tool for interdiction and isolation rather than a substitute for ground control. That adjustment paid dividends later in Italy and elsewhere. Equally important was the lesson in multinational coordination. Cassino brought together formations from across the Allied coalition, each with different doctrines, strengths, and constraints. Early phases suffered from friction and learning curves. Later phases showed the advantage of matching formations to terrain and integrating capabilities deliberately. Cassino accelerated Allied institutional learning under fire. For the German side, Cassino validated a defensive approach built on delay rather than decision. The Gustav Line did exactly what it was designed to do. It absorbed Allied strength for months and bought time. What it could not do was change the strategic balance. Cassino demonstrated the ceiling of defensive delay when the attacker possesses overwhelming resources and is willing to pay the cost. That ceiling has strategic implications. Delay can shape campaigns, but it cannot reverse outcomes when the attacker adapts and sustains pressure. Cassino underscores the difference between tactical success and strategic effect. German units fought skillfully and inflicted heavy losses, but the defense consumed resources it could not replace and ultimately yielded ground it could not afford to lose. The aftermath of Cassino confirmed this imbalance. Once the Gustav Line snapped, the Italian campaign regained momentum. The Liri Valley opened. Allied logistics improved. Operational tempo increased. German forces withdrew to new lines, but none matched Cassino's strength. The battle marked the end of a phase in Italy where defense could impose stalemate at acceptable cost. Cassino also reframed Allied expectations about time and cost. The campaign would not be quick. Fortified terrain would demand patience. Progress would be measured, not dramatic. This realism informed subsequent operations, reducing the temptation to seek decisive results through frontal assaults alone. Beyond Italy, Cassino's legacy lies in its demonstration of how modern fortified systems must be dismantled. Isolation precedes penetration. Attrition must be targeted at the system, not just the front. When those principles are applied consistently, even the strongest positions become untenable. When they are ignored, courage and firepower are squandered. The abbey's ruins came to symbolize destruction, but the real significance of Cassino is analytical. It shows how battles are decided long before lines collapse, by the slow removal of the defender's ability to function. Cassino did not fall because the defenders ran out of will. It fell because they ran out of options. That is why Cassino endures as a case study. Not as a tale of futility, but as a lesson in how wars are actually won when conditions are unfavorable. Attrition, applied intelligently and patiently, can achieve what speed cannot. When the German line finally snapped, it did so not with a dramatic surge, but with a quiet inevitability. The system failed. The ground followed. If you want fact-heavy, no-myth breakdowns of battles where attrition, terrain, and systems decided outcomes, subscribe to WW2 Battles.